friends at the Aspen Security Forum. I want to ask you first about the fact that President Trump said recently that President Obama was begging for a meeting with Kim Jong-un, but that Chairman Kim,
comedy here. Okay.
starting with comedy, as she says, that Chairman Kim would not grant him that meeting. Did that happen?
No.
No?
No,
Please explain.
I hate to put it as bluntly as it needs to be put, but that's yet another lie. There's no basis in fact. President Obama made it very clear from his campaign in 2007 and 2008 that when it served the United States' national interests, he was prepared to engage with our adversaries. We never sought, in the case of Kim Jong-un, such an encounter, nor did Kim Jong-un seek one with us. Although there were diplomatic contacts at various levels throughout the Obama administration. And we worked in various ways both to ratchet up the pressure on North Korea, coordinate with our key partners in the region, and try to address the still very problematic issue of North Korea's nuclear program. But the notion that President Trump has fabricated that somehow an effort was made that was rejected is just false, and I'm sure, unfortunately, that won't be the first time I have to say that today.
Well, there have been 3 meetings so far between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. One at the DMZ, where President Trump, famously walked across the line into North Korea. What has been accomplished, do you think, by that?
By the last meeting when he walked across the line, or the series of meetings?
That there is a personal relationship now.
Well, it's certainly better than fire and fury and a hot war, which seemed early in the administration to be something not to be discounted. Having said that, when you look in substance at what's been accomplished, it's frankly very little. What I worry about is that the long-standing United States objective of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization is seemingly less the priority of this administration. We're interested potentially in steps that fall far short of that. We've achieved nothing in that direction. What we do have, and I think it's better than the alternative, is a voluntary and temporary moratorium on missile and nuclear tests, which is certainly better than the alternative. But that's about all that one can say has been accomplished. Meanwhile, the North Koreans have every ability to continue the enrichment and reprocessing activities that lead them to expand their arsenal, and we have every reason to believe that they continue to expand their arsenal even as this process of stop-start diplomacy continues.
And they are now suggesting that they might resume long-range missile tests if we resume the what used to be routine joint military exercises with South Korea.
Well, first of all, I think we made a serious mistake, and it seems to be one that the president did on a whim without consultation with the Defense Department or South Korea when he suspended our bilateral annual exercises, and there are actually many exercises over the course of a normal year. We've now gone more than a year without those annual large-scale exercises, which undermines readiness, military readiness in an important way. And this exercise that was going to happen was much smaller scale, exercise that doesn't do what we actually need to do on a regular basis for readiness. And yet, even this small-scale exercise, which the president presumably didn't take off the table after his first meeting in Singapore, the North Koreans are objecting to and trying to turn the screws to suggest that should we go ahead with that small-scale exercise, that they might resume nuclear or missile testing. I think that shows you how fragile this whole process is.
The president has suggested that it's okay for the short-range missile tests, which have resumed, which are threatening to Japan and South Korea, our allies, and are violations of UN resolutions as well, as long as the long-range missiles that threaten the United States don't resume. Is this undercutting our relationship with our Asian allies?
Absolutely. First of all, as you say, these short-range tests are prohibited under international law, under the sanctions that the United States over many years has worked very hard to achieve and sustain implementation of. So, for the message from Washington to be to Seoul and Tokyo that, frankly, we don't care what happens to you as long as these missiles aren't coming or have the potential to come in our direction. That grossly undermines our alliances, and it calls into question our commitment to our presence on the Korean Peninsula, our presence in Japan, and our readiness to stand up to a potential North Korean threat that is actually more than a missile test, but in fact, a substantive, serious threat to our allies in the region. So that undermines our leadership, that undermines our strength in terms of dealing with North Korea, and it further exacerbates the tensions that are just below the surface in these very critical bilateral relationships.
I want to ask you about Iran, and we're out of the Iran nuclear deal. We have a series of escalating incidents in the Strait of Hormuz. An offer in the last 24 hours from Foreign Minister Zarif to begin negotiations and more intrusive inspections if there would be a cessation of all American sanctions, a non-starter from the American perspective. John McLaughlin has said today that he thinks it's an offer that ought to be pursued. Most likely it wouldn't be from this administration, but where are we? Where we've reached a stage more broadly where the President of the United States says he called off an offensive strike against Iran 10 minutes before launch. I'm wondering if you could take a step back and look at the decision-making process. How do we get to a process where we get out of a multilateral agreement, the Iran nuclear deal, and take a series of steps, including sanctioning the RCG, the Revolutionary Guard, for a lot of misbehavior, acknowledged misbehavior? Have we thought through the next steps, each step of the way? Are there deputy committee meetings? Not that I know of, but maybe you know better than I. How does John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and the national security team conduct foreign policy in terms of looking ahead as they make these very critical decisions?
There's a lot in that question, Andrea.
I know.
Okay. Let me try to talk about Iran and then talk about the national security decision-making process or lack thereof. With respect to Iran, I mean, as you all know, what the president decided to do against the very strong advice of all of his senior advisors, and if you agree with Kim Darroch's assessment that's now been leaked, which I think in all likelihood is accurate, purely out of spite, purely out of an eagerness to undo literally as much as he can that Obama has done, the president pulled out of the Iran deal with absolutely no plan B. And now he says his goal is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Well, the Iran deal, whether you like it or not, was being completely adhered to without violation by Iran, not only for the duration of our tenure in the deal, but actually for over a year after we violated the deal, abrogated it, and reimposed sanctions. Now we have no means, short of the use of force, which itself is not sufficiently effective, and I'll explain why, to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon should it decide to go forward. We had that capacity while we remained in the deal. We had all of our allies with us in support of that endeavor. And we had, and we could lose at any moment, the most intrusive inspection regime ever established. Iran is gradually testing how many different ways and steps it can take to get out of the deal before we react. And what Trump has done is to set up a situation where the likelihood of conflict is vastly increased. Whereas had he stayed in the deal and worked with the Europeans to try to strengthen its provisions beyond its duration and to address separately, but nonetheless importantly, many of the concerns that we have all had about Iran's behavior beyond its nuclear program, we would be in a far better place. But now what we have is escalating tensions, a real risk of planned or inadvertent conflict, and no way to climb down, and no pathway back into the deal that this administration seems to be willing to explore. I think if they were willing to explore a way back, there is one. And I've laid out some incremental steps that I thought could be taken. But I also agree with John McLaughlin that it's noteworthy that for the first time, the Iranians, through Foreign Minister Zarif, are offering something, whether we think it's sufficient, whether we like the quid pro quo that is the proposal or not. It is an opening, and it is one we would be wise to explore. It doesn't mean we take the deal. It's not a binary choice, but it does open the door, the aperture, to the potential for exploring what we can achieve that would get us back minimally to the constraints and confines of the deal, and look to move beyond that if that's indeed possible. But where we are now is really the worst of all worlds. We haven't improved Iran's behavior at all on the other factors that we're concerned about, its missile program, its support for terrorism, its human rights record. Yet we have lost the constraints that we're working with respect to the Iran deal.
We talked very briefly about John Bolton and the national security process. And I know that sounds weedy, but arguably it's very important. A year ago, I was sitting here with Dan Coates and informed him that there was a tweet that 5 days after a disastrous Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin, the president, the White House was inviting Vladimir Putin to a return summit. There had been no note-takers, no American note-takers for 2 hours at that meeting. And famously, he was inviting Putin. And the National Security Advisor had not known about it. And to my best of my reporting, the Secretary of State had not been informed of that as well. There was no discussion. It was basically Putin to Trump to Bolton to Sarah Sanders send out a tweet. How does that, how damaging is that in terms of the way we conduct foreign policy, the way other leaders view the opportunity to exploit and flatter this president into making snap decisions?
There are at least two fundamental problems with the national security decision-making process as we speak. One, the Deputies Committee, the Principals Committee, this is the cabinet level and sub-cabinet level body that I chaired as National Security Advisor at the principals level, that involves all the relevant cabinet agencies and that in normal times meets to deliberate over the most important or pressing issues. It's not meeting regularly. That process is eroded, to put it mildly. And instead, it seems that the National Security Advisor is sort of engaging bilaterally with the various cabinet colleagues and limiting the opportunity for collective decision-making and collective assessments of the challenges and airing all of the various issues and presenting all of the principals' views faithfully and fully to the president, which is the role of the National Security Advisor. So that's problem one, and it's dangerous and it's dysfunctional, and it means that not only are the most high-profile issues like Iran and North Korea and the like not getting the attention and the careful deliberation that they deserve, but then there's the second problem, and the second problem is that regardless of what might happen at the principals table, the president wakes up and does what the hell he wants to do on any given day, on any given moment, without the benefit of the input and wisdom of his national security team and the experts in the interagency. And that is exceedingly dangerous. And as you said, it makes him very malleable, makes him subject to his own whim, but also the manipulations of adversaries and friends alike who may flatter him or cajole him or prompt him into doing things that don't accord with our interests. And we see it literally almost every day. So how do we get to a point where we're 10 minutes from war with Iran? I mean, this wasn't going to be, by the way, just a couple strikes and everybody laughs and shakes it off and goes home. That was going to be the start of a war, because the Iranians are not going to sit there and take that. So how do we get to that situation? It's bewildering to me, as somebody who's sat through many decisions about the use of force, that one, the president could make such a judgment and then with the planes in midair, turn it around. But secondly, that if the reasons the president gave for changing his mind, which were that he realized there would be a lot of civilian casualties, hadn't been sufficiently surfaced to his full attention prior to the launch of the strikes, we're in deep trouble.
Isn't that the first thing that the military presents, is a series of what the casualties would be on an escalating scale?
It's absolutely one of the first things. And if it's not, it's the first question that the president should ask, or the national security advisor, failing that.
Can you imagine another American president inviting the Russian ambassador and the Russian foreign minister into the Oval Office and blurting out very closely held intelligence from a strategic ally?
Highly classified intelligence? No, I cannot. I mean, I can't imagine that. I can't imagine the president of the United States sitting one-on-one for hours in meetings with Vladimir Putin with no note taker. I mean, I could go on, but there are just so many aspects of how national security policy is being conducted that not only break every norm, but run the great risk that decisions get made that have not been fully considered or vetted, and that the consequences could be quite deadly.
And I just want to say to the audience, I've been covering foreign policy for many years, and covered Brent Scowcroft, Condoleezza Rice, and a lot of your Republican predecessors. And these were not norms in their White Houses either.
No.
And so we're not talking
This is
partisan politics here.
This is sui generis.
Another thing that is not normal is to have a president of the United States saying things that are now being described today by Angela Merkel as racist, and by Boris Johnson and Theresa May and Justin Trudeau and other foreign leaders, to say nothing of Americans. Now, just within the last hour, the president said he is unhappy that a congresswoman can hate our country after he yesterday, under some pressure from reportedly his daughter and other Republicans, denied that he had inspired the racist chant in North Carolina. The videotape says it tells a different story. So what message is he communicating to Americans and to people around the world?
Well, the message to Americans is that only some of us count. And I've never heard that out of the mouth of an American president before. There's no other words for it. It's xenophobic, it's racist, it's divisive, and it's not who we are. But it seems to be who this president is, and I take no joy in saying that. It's tragic, and it undermines the fabric of our national unity, of our democracy. The only Americans who count, it seems, are those that the president thinks will vote for him. And anybody else doesn't count. You heard, in effect, Lindsey Graham validate that yesterday, or the day before, when he said, well, as long as he's not racist, because if you were Somali wearing a MAGA hat, he'd let you in the White House and embrace you. So, in other words, the only Americans who are worthy of embrace are those that have or would vote for this president. So instead of having a president who represents all of us and views all of us as worthy of concern, as every prior president in my lifetime and yours has, whether you like them or not, we have this new, very ugly, divisive approach to leadership. And it undermines us internationally. And when you hear our closest allies repudiating the president and calling his comments racist, that should concern all of us deeply. But it's true. And it means that when we need those allies to join with us in the next big challenge, whether that challenge is dealing with the ISIS 2.0 as we were able to rally over 70 countries to our side to deal with ISIS in the first instance, or whether it's fighting a global pandemic, or whether it's dealing with a conflict in the South China Sea, or Russia as it invaded Ukraine, we were able to bring our allies together with us and join with us not only on the basis of our power, but on the basis of the power of our example and the values that we stood for. And now, quite to the contrary, we have our allies saying to us that what they hear out of the mouth of the president is wholly inconsistent with the values that we purportedly share with our allies.
Related to that is, of course, our immigration policy. We have, for all intents and purposes, stopped asylum procedures on our southern border by this latest executive order. And that follows cutting off State Department aid to the Northern Triangle countries. These are laws embedded in congressional action as well as international treaties. How can the United States stop the right of application for asylum to people on our southern border?
Well, I don't think ultimately we'll be able to do that. I think there are challenges in the courts, and I think that it's going to be very, very difficult to sustain a blanket policy of denying asylum seekers even the opportunity to have their cases heard. Now, I gather that in the last day or two, the administration, not at the presidential level, but at a lower level, has acknowledged that, in fact, this is a pilot program that they're going to try on small sections of the border and see how that works out. Whether that's the case or not, it will be challenged, and I think it will be, in all likelihood, overturned.
Oh, the Obama administration was criticized by many people in the community for its deportations and struggled with these issues. Jay Johnson has acknowledged that as well. But how did we get to the stage where we have the numbers of people and the conditions that we are seeing and that members of Congress are reporting when they do gain access to these facilities, which are appalling? There's no other way to describe these conditions.
Well, the conditions are appalling. The policy of separating children from families, from parents, adults is appalling, and it's completely unnecessary. I mean, yes, we have in the past and at present had large numbers of people coming to the border. We had this very problem in 2014 during the Obama administration, and we didn't separate families and put kids in horrible conditions. What we did was work with HHS and other aspects of the executive branch to try to expand the facilities available to these migrants, even as we tried to enforce the law at the border. And no inspector general, no members of Congress came and visited those sites and reported the kinds of conditions that we're hearing now. The difference is, one, in the Obama administration, we faced this challenge. We tried to address it to the extent we possibly could in a humane and decent fashion. And now it seems that the policy of the current administration is to make the conditions so awful and appalling that, in their judgment, it becomes a deterrent for people to come to the United States. Well, there's many problems with that, beside the fact that it's a grotesque treatment of fellow human beings. But the reason these people are coming in the first place, as you well know, is because they fear for their lives. And if that's the choice, they're going to keep coming. And so, we need to undo the president's very ill-considered decision to stop all assistance to the Northern Triangle Central American countries. That decision seems to be designed to encourage more people to come. The investments that we started to make and that were sustained for a period of years to try to help these countries deal with the root causes of crime, of poverty, of violence, that is what is spurring the outflow has been abandoned at very much the time when we need it most. So I think on many levels, one needs to question the motives as well as the practical policies that have led us to this shameful condition.
I wanted to ask you how you navigate relationships, strategic relationships with leaders around the world and an open embrace of dictators. Famously, Barack Obama had a terrible relationship with Vladimir Putin. We understood that and saw canceled meetings and stare downs at various times between the two at G20s. But what we now see is Vladimir Putin, Erdogan, Duterte, MBS, at the last G20 in Osaka, MBS, who had been basically shunned by many other leaders after the Khashoggi murder, was now embraced because of the jocular nature and the private meeting, the breakfast with the president, and is now, elevated again. He's supposed to host the next G20, should he?
No. No. I mean, the larger problem is the denigration of our allies and the imposition of punitive measures against our allies, whether they're tariffs or penalties against their companies for abiding by a deal with respect to Iran that has been validated by international law and that the United States itself negotiated. Disparaging individual allied leaders and the whole concept of the Western alliance on the one hand, while on the other hand, lifting up, elevating, embracing, and locking arms with some of the most dangerous and despicable leaders on the planet. That's not who we are and who we have been. Just because we have a difficult or hostile relationship with a country doesn't mean we can't engage them. And indeed, under the Obama administration, even after the invasion of Ukraine, which is when the relationship really deteriorated, President Obama talked to Vladimir Putin more than a dozen times on the phone and met with him on multiple occasions at various international fora. So we have to deal with countries and leaders that we don't respect and disagree with. But that doesn't mean that we have to embrace them and elevate them and absolve their behavior in its worst forms. And that's what President Trump has done. And I think it very much undermines the confidence of our allies in who we are and our constancy and whether we'll uphold our treaty obligations. It completely casts to the wind our core values of democracy and respect for human rights. And it emboldens leaders like Mohammed bin Salman, who think, with good reason apparently, that he can get away literally with murder and face zero consequence.
What does it say to the world and to him when the president ignores the conclusion of the intelligence community about the responsibility, his responsibility?
It means he can get away with murder. I mean, this is the same problem we have with respect to Russia. The intelligence community has been very professional and very responsible in faithfully reporting its judgments and findings, whether with respect to Russian interference in our democracy or with respect to the Khashoggi murder. The president has decided to discount and denigrate the professionals in our intelligence community, and in the face of all facts, defying the facts, taking the word of some of the worst actors instead. And I think the damage that does to our domestic institutions, including our intelligence community, can't be overstated. But what's worse is the message that it sends to these dictators, that there is literally no consequence, whether arms sales continue around the back of Congress, or we continue to support a totally excessive war in Yemen, or we say to Mohammed bin Salman, go ahead and do what you want to do inside your country or outside to an American resident, and no problem.
Now, as we sit here,
What now?
we don't know, but according to Iranian television, Iranian media, the IRGC says that they have seized a British oil tanker for allegedly violating, they say, international regulations. So we don't know if this is the case, but this is just another incident in the Strait. So it's a British oil tanker named the Stenom Piro, not sure of the actual name. So we are again on another precipice as this escalation continues.
Yeah. Each of these incidents in isolation are not especially alarming. In the aggregate, they are, given that we're dealing with players who seem to have little interest in de-escalating, or little interest in taking opportunities to de-escalate. I think, I have no idea the validity of that report, but it wouldn't surprise me given that the Iranians have been angry since the British seized one of their vessels.
And we should point out, as people here know, that there are divisions there between Zarif and Rouhani on one side, supposedly, and the Revolutionary Guard, which is still reacting to the sanctioning by the State Department of their leadership as well. So
those are long-standing divisions that have likely only been exacerbated.
let me ask you about your book, Tough Love. You've written a book that's coming out, I believe, October 8th. We're looking forward to reading it and hearing more about, your exploration, obviously your evolution, your extraordinary experience in foreign policy on the national stage, but also growing up in an amazing family.
Well, thank you for mentioning it. I'm looking forward to it coming out. It's many things in one. It's a family history and a personal story of my growing up in Washington, D.C. in the 60s and 70s in a interestingly bipartisan environment, in a family that was involved in public issues and public life, as an African-American young girl in white and privileged educational environments and the experiences that led to. It's about my work in government in the Clinton and the Obama administrations and the difficult issues that we dealt with in both contexts. And it's my personal rendering of what I learned along the way, where I made mistakes, where I think I learned, where I succeeded, and what contributed to that. And then similarly, through the Obama administration, where I try to take a sober look at various of the key issues that I was privileged to work on. And at the same time, it's a very personal story about how I was raised, the challenges I went through as a child, my parents' very difficult and bitter divorce and what effects that had on me. It's about being a mother of two young kids as I was doing these rather challenging jobs. It's about being a daughter of aging and ailing parents, and like many people, being in that sandwich generation of dealing with kids on the one hand and aging parents on the other. So it's all of those things in one. But I think if I were to summarize the key theme, it's really about resilience. Resilience in the case of my parents and grandparents in the face of racial discrimination, resilience in an environment where in many respects I was one of very few like me, and resilience in the face of some of the very public challenges I faced as UN ambassador and national security advisor. So it's what I learned from that, and it's also ultimately a an elegy for our national unity and our democracy and what we must do, in my view, to overcome our domestic divisions and to be strong and cohesive, even in the moment that we're living in, that we've been talking about for most of this hour.
And finally, as you remind me, as the former UN ambassador, we haven't had a UN ambassador since December. What are we missing by not having a UN ambassador among some 20 vacancies or acting secretaries where you have cabinet secretaries or leaders of agencies who cannot have their own chiefs of staff and their own important undersecretaries and assistant secretaries who can answer to them and create a team to carry out policy?
Well, obviously, when the United States lacks a UN ambassador or a Secretary of Defense or a Secretary of Homeland Security for many, many months, we are not firing on all cylinders by definition. And in the context of the UN, where every day we are engaging with literally the entire world, countries that are friendly, countries that are unfriendly, and having to negotiate on some of the most important issues and advance our interests and defend our values, to do that without the benefit of a Senate-confirmed ambassador at the top of the mission who has the opportunity to participate in the policymaking process is a huge detriment. And I hope very much that it won't be long before our nominee, Kelly Craft, has the opportunity to get confirmed and get up to New York. She's had her hearing, and I hope she'll get there.
Well, I want to thank you, and we have a few minutes for questions, so let's look around the room. Yes, sir. We have some mics floating, and
you seem to have some different views than the man in the White House. What do you do about the tens of millions of his base that back him tooth and nail? What do you say to them?
You respect them. They're fellow Americans who are entitled to their opinions and entitled to their vote, just as those who disagree deserve respect and deserve a voice and not to be denigrated.
I should point out that the national security, the director of national intelligence, I should say, today appointed an official to be in charge of election security. So one would hope that we are, as we did in 2018, to the best of our knowledge, there were a lot of thwarted attempts to interfere, foreign adversaries attempting to interfere with our elections in the midterms. So we would hope that in 2020, we can be a lot more aggressive in fighting off attempts at interference. We have time for one more question.
Over there.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank you for your candid and also inspiring remarks.
Thank you.
I, like you, very much believe in our democracy. And I'm just wondering, you know, according to the qualifications for someone to run for president, correct me if I'm wrong, you have to be a certain age and a citizen of our country. I'm wondering if there is some way to, shall we say, upgrade the qualifications for someone to run. Thank you.
We have to be born in the
You have to be
United
born
States.
in the United States, be 35 years old. I think we'd have a bit of a debate and a discussion about how to define those additional qualifications. I think we as voters get the opportunity to decide that question on an individual basis. It might be nice to envision some additional ones, but obviously, as you know, that would require a constitutional amendment, 2/3 of the states to ratify it. I think we're a long way from that. And I'm not even sure that, frankly, that's what we need. I think we need committed, patriotic Americans who put country first in both parties to step forward and offer to lead, and do so despite how difficult it is, and it could not be more important. And so I'm hopeful that if we were having this conversation 5, 10 years from now, we wouldn't have to put it in terms of new qualifications in the Constitution, but could find ourselves satisfied that in both parties we have qualified, capable leaders who care deeply about this country and want to govern in a unifying and non-polarizing fashion.
Well, I think that we have exhausted our time, if not our issues.
Not the issue.
So, can we take another couple of questions? That would be wonderful. Ambassador Korologos,
Hi, Tom.
the man we used to call the 101st Senator.
Hi, Susan.
Nice to see you.
Given what you're all talking about and what we've heard here for the last 2 days, how would you rate, except for Vice President Biden, the foreign policy experience of the other 19 characters up there on the stages? For
You mean candidates, sir?
Candidates.
Well, obviously, it varies enormously, with as many as there are in the field. I think there are a number, including those of the sitting senators who have served for some considerable time, including on relevant committees, that have substantive, serious experience. I think those that have been veterans have experienced firsthand many of the critical challenges that are relevant to serve as commander-in-chief. Then there's some who seemingly have very little experience. So I don't think one can generalize. To be frank, I think there are plenty of candidates in the field that have sufficient foreign policy experience, and even more importantly, good judgment. But obviously, Vice President Biden stands head and shoulders in terms of tenure, in terms of years of experience and breadth of experience on foreign policy.
Any other questions?
One over here.
Back there.
Secretary Rice, thank you very much for your service and for giving us your frank opinions today. We heard from the Secretary General of NATO on Wednesday that NATO is only valid as long as it has the capability and the belief by the other side that we will honor Section 5. Yesterday we heard from both Joe Nye and Admiral Davidson that Japan is our #1 military ally. Now the leaders of both Japan and Australia have questioned the credibility of this administration being able to stand up to the treaties. Australia and Japan have had an informal military alliance for years. Stratworld this morning reported they are going to actually act on that. They want to team with Europe and not the United States to have a credible set of allies. Do you think our credibility on our alliances can survive another 2 to 6 years under this kind of a situation?
I hope so, but I worried enormously. Let's talk about 2 years or year and a half, because I'm an optimist.
I'm a nonpartisan.
I think we've done, as I've indicated throughout this conversation, substantial damage to the fabric of our alliance relationships in Asia and in Europe. And it's tragic, but not surprising that our allies are taking steps that suggest they cannot, in all confidence, depend on the durability of our commitment to those alliance relationships. That's tragic, that's terrible, and we have got to rectify that as quickly as possible. I think the good news is that on a bipartisan basis, in Congress and beyond, there is little question of the centrality and utility of our alliance networks. And when the bipartisan leadership of Congress invites the NATO Secretary General to speak before Congress, that's maybe perceived as a symbolic act, but I think it's a very important statement of, across the board understanding of how important those relationships are. But you cannot denigrate them day in and day out and not exact a price, a cost. And the other thing that needs to be mentioned is that these alliances don't function on autopilot. I mean, we, the United States, have a role to play in being the glue that knits these relationships together. So, today when we have a challenge between South Korea and Japan, as we've had in the past, when there's palpable friction between them, what we would normally do, what we've done in the past, we did in 2014, was to bring them together and try to be that glue that helps them smooth over their differences. If I'm not mistaken, when asked about this today, in the Oval Office, the president was like, why do we have to do everything for everybody? Which I think undervalues the importance of each of those countries individually, but seems to, again, suggest a lack of understanding or appreciation about how and why these alliances are so important. So we're going to have a lot of repair work to do in 2 years. And if it's 6 years, I really hesitate to think what we'll be up against, quite honestly.
Okay, one
Can we
last,
end on an optimistic note?
yes, one last question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Rice. My name is Amarita Torres. I'm formerly with the State Department as an FSO, and I was at the U.S. mission to the UN most recently.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you for your service, too. I am interested in diversity in foreign policy and what we can do to really increase the role of women of color, women, people from diverse perspectives, personalities, LGBTQ communities. I've seen a real sort of gutting of the State Department, including from these particular communities. So I'm wondering advice that you have and ways that we can attract diverse talent.
Well, first of all, contrary to what you might expect me to say, I strongly encourage those who are serving in the State Department, Foreign Service officers, civil servants, and in other agencies who are concerned or frustrated or otherwise feeling alienated to stay. We need that talent across the national security agencies. The experience of our career public servants cannot be replicated swiftly or easily. We cannot afford a generational gap in qualified, experienced people serving in these national security agencies. And I say that in full knowledge of how difficult some people are finding it, including, if not especially, people of color, LGBTQ people, women potentially. But we have to stay and be part of rebuilding, to get back to the previous question, our leadership, our values, our alliances, all the things that make us strong and therefore safer. In the Obama administration, particularly in the last couple of years, we worked very hard to prioritize expanding and broadening diversity within the national security agencies. And I'm proud to say had the robust support of all of the secretaries and agency leaders across the administration and national security. And we codified some practices and policies that I think are very beneficial in terms of rectifying the diversity gap, and there is a considerable gap, particularly among foreign service officers, particularly in the senior ranks, as well as in the senior military ranks. And one does that not because diversity is nice, and not because it's a PC thing to do. One does it because, as we found in government, like the private sector, like the nonprofit world, through study after study, it makes for better decision making, it makes for better outcomes, and it makes us stronger. And that's why, retaining and attracting top talent, including top diverse talent, throughout our national security agencies, frankly, throughout our government, is essential to our strength and functioning as a global leader and as a democracy. So it's not in my view, it's not a optional, nice to do. It's an absolute necessity.
Well, I could not agree more with that. As someone who covers the State Department, the brain drain is profound, and we really need people to just stick with it and try to tough this out, because we're losing a generation. As Secretary Albright has said, fewer and fewer of her students are taking the Foreign Service exam, and it's really demoralizing, and we're going to face a real crisis in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Susan Rice. And thank you to Nick Burns for making this all possible.